Hello there everybody, and welcome back to another EDH gameplay video brought to you by Affinity for Commander. My name is Martin, and today we have a game for you involving a general of the Boros Legion, the captain of a plane-travelling ship, a knight of unquestionable loyalty, and a king who devours everything in sight. But before we begin, I'd like to personally thank all of the absolutely incredible patrons listed on screen for their heartwarming generosity. We wouldn't be able to continue making videos such as these without your support, so thank you. Also, if you decide to make a purchase from any of these websites, then be sure to do so via our affiliate links in the video description. It won't cost you anything extra, but it really helps us out. And if you haven't already, then go and check out altersleeves.com, where you can find thousands of super cool designs on perfect fit sleeves to really bling out your decks, just to be sure to quote us as the ones who sent you. But that is enough of that, let's take a look at those opening hands. I am playing my brand new General Ferrous Rociric deck, which contains a large amount of multicolored spells to trigger my commander's ability. In addition to this, I run a lot of token support cards, as well as pretty much every golem tribal support that I could find in red and white. My opening hand consists of Arcane Signet, Sacred Fire, Rootborn Defences, Command Tower, Telemorphic Expanse, Rugged Prairie, and a Plains.
Tom is playing his Korvold Fey-Cursed King deck, which aims to turn the sacrifice drawbacks of cards into an upside. In order to stay ahead of his opponents, he also runs a decent ramp package, and looks to make the most of this by including a cheeky landfall sub-theme. Tom's starting hand contains Nature's Law, 3 Visits, Solemn Simulacrum, Splendid Reclamation, the Gitrog Monster, Windswept Heath, and a Mountain.
Danny is playing his Jhoira Weatherlight Captain deck, which focuses mainly on artifacts as opposed to other historic card types. He runs a lot of cards that lower the mana value of these spells, allowing him to cast multiple artifacts a turn, and looks to draw as many cards as humanly possible with his commander's ability. Danny keeps an opening hand consisting of Enthusiastic Mechanaut, Mirror Maid, Sculpting Steel, Trophy Mage, Scrap Mastery, Izzet Boilerworks, and Storm-Carved Coast.
And finally, Hugo is playing his Syr Gwyn Hero of Ashvale Knight tribal deck. As well as the aforementioned knights, he also runs a decent amount of equipment to make the most of his commander's abilities, as well as a surprising amount of card draw for a deck lacking blue. Hugo keeps a starting hand of Swords to Plowshares, Ariel, Knight of Windgrace, Merciless Eviction, Boros Garrison, Sacred Foundry, Bajuka Bog, and a Plains. Hugo wins the die roll and starts things off by playing a tapped Sacred Foundry before passing to Danny.
Danny plays Storm-Carved Coast and passes.
Tom plays Windswept Heath and sacrifices the land, paying 1 to do so. He searches his library for Overgrown Tomb, puts the land into play tapped, and ends his turn.
I play Command Tower and pass to Hugo.
In his turn, Hugo plays a Plains and passes.
Danny plays Izzet Boilerworks, returning Storm-Carved Coast to his hand. He then discards down to 7 and ends his turn.
Tom plays a Mountain and casts 3 Visits. He searches his library for Cinderglade, puts the land into play tapped, and passes to Martin.
I begin my turn by playing a Plains and then cast Arcane Signet. With nothing more to do, I pass the turn.
Hugo starts his turn by casting Knight of the White Orchid, and puts a Plains into play from his library with a Lion Rider's ETB. Next, he plays Boros Garrison as his land for turn, returning Sacred Foundry to his hand with the land's ability, and ends his turn.
Danny replays Storm-Carved Coast and then casts Enthusiastic Mechanaut. With nothing more to do, he passes to Tom.
Tom casts a retro-looking Nature's Law, putting a basic forest onto the battlefield in this way. Not yet finished, he casts Viscera and passes the turn.
In my turn, I play Telemorphic Expanse and then cast my commander, General Ferrous Rociric. Happy with my play, I end my turn.
Hugo plays a swamp and then moves to combat. Here he attacks Danny with his knight, and Danny declares no blockers, taking 2 damage. In his post-combat main phase, Hugo casts Ariel, Knight of Windgrace, and passes to Danny.
In his turn, Danny casts Reckless Fireweaver, and then suspends Lotus Bloom with 3 time counters on it. Missing his land drop, Danny passes the turn.
Tom plays Pachuca Bog as his land for turn, exiling Danny's graveyard with the land's ETB. Next, he casts Solemn Simulacrum, and Martin responds by sacrificing his Terramorphic Expanse. Martin puts a mountain into play from his library, Tom puts a forest into play from his library, and Tom ends his turn.
I begin my turn by playing Rugged Prairie, and then cast Justice Strike. My commander's ability triggers, creating me a 4/4 Golem token, and I have Ariel deal herself 4 damage.
Stop hitting yourself.
This is enough to send the Panther Rider to the graveyard, and I then move to combat. Here I attack Hugo with Ferrous Rociric, dealing him 3 damage and pass the turn to him.
Hugo plays Temple of Silence, scrolling the top card of his library to the bottom, and passes.
Danny removes a time counter from Lotus Bloom and once again misses his land drop.
Ouch.
Not to be deterred, he casts Altar of the Brood for free thanks to his Mechanaut, and Reckless Fireweaver deals the rest of us 1 damage. Not yet finished, Danny casts Sculpting Steel. Not wanting him to make a second cost-reducing goblin, I respond to this by casting Sacred Fire, targeting the Mechanaut. General Rokiric creates me a 4/4 Golem, the goblin dies, and I gain 2 life. Danny then has Sculpting Steel enter as a copy of Altar of the Brood, and Tom, Hugo and I each take 1 damage from the Fireweaver before milling a card from the original altar. Absolutely livid with my blatant disregard for his mana screw, Danny ends the turn.
In his turn, Tom casts his commander, Korvold, Fey-Cursed King. He sacrifices his Solemn Simulacrum to the dragon's ETB, drawing 2 cards, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Korvold. Not yet finished, Tom plays Woodland Cemetery, and casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing a forest to the spell. He puts another +1/+1 counter on his commander, and puts Verdant Catacombs onto the battlefield from his library. Tom then pays 1 life to sacrifice his fetch land, drawing another card, putting a third +1/+1 counter on the dragon, and putting Smouldering Marsh into play from his library. Pleased with his turn, Tom passes to Martin.
I play Path of Ancestry and then cast Showdown of the Skald. I make a 4/4 Golem thanks to my commander's ability, and exile the top 4 cards of my library with my Saga. Moving to combat, I attack Danny with 2 of my golems, and he declares no blocks, taking 8 damage. With nothing more to do, I pass the turn.
Hugo replays Sacred Foundry, paying 2 life to have the land enter untapped. He then casts his own commander, Syr Gwyn, Hero of Ash Vale, closely followed by Stoneforge Masterwork. Hugo uses his commander's ability to equip the armor to his Knight of the White Orchid for 0 mana, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Danny with a Cat Riding Knight, drawing a card, and losing a life thanks to Syr Gwyn. Danny once again declares no blocks, taking 3 damage, and Hugo ends his turn.
Danny removes the penultimate time counter from his suspended Lotus, and once again draws a non-land card.
Ouch.
Not ready to give up just yet though, Danny taps out to cast Mirror Maid, having the enchantment enter as a copy of Altar of the Brood. Tom, Hugo and I each mill 2, and Reckless Fireweaver deals the 3 of us 1 damage. Unable to do anything else, Danny passes to Tom.
In his turn, Tom casts Scoot Swarm, and then plays a forest. His Insect's Landfall ability triggers, creating a copy of itself, and Tom uses his remaining mana to cast the Gitrog monster. Not yet finished, Tom sacrifices 1 of his Scoot Swarms to Visarisia, drawing a card and putting a +1/+1 counter on Korvold. He then scries 1, putting the top card of his library on the bottom, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Martin with Korvold, sacrificing his Seer to the dragon's ability. Tom draws, putting another +1/+1 counter on his commander, and, unable to block, Martin takes 9 damage. Happy with his position in the game, Tom passes the turn.
I begin my turn by putting a lore counter on my Saga, and then play the planes that was exiled below it. Next I cast the Tempered Steel that was also exiled by Showdown of the Skald, putting a +1/+1 counter on my commander with the Saga's second ability. Moving to combat, I attack Tom with all 3 of my now 6/6 golems, and he blocks one of them with his frog and another with his insect. Both of Tom's creatures and the golem blocked by the Gitrog monster are destroyed, Tom takes 6 damage, and I end my turn.
In his turn, Hugo casts Black Blade Reforged and equips it to his commander for free. Next, he plays Bojuka Bog as his land for turn, exiling Tom's graveyard in this way, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Martin with Knight of the White Orchid, and Tom with Syr Gwyn, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life to his commander's ability. Now the defending player declares any blocks, with Tom taking 12 damage and Martin taking 3. In his post-combat main phase, Hugo casts Knight's Whisper, drawing 2 more cards and losing 2 more life. Still not finished, Hugo casts Fervent Champion and moves his Stoneforge Masterwork over to the newly played Knight. Pleased with his board state, Hugo passes to Danny.
Danny removes the final time counter from his Lotus Bloom, casting the spell and triggering the rest of his non-land permanents. Everybody else mills 3 cards and takes 1 damage, and Danny taps out to cast Burnished Heart. Hugo, Tom and I each mill another 3 cards and take 1 more damage, and Danny sacrifices his Lotus to add 3 blue mana to his mana pool. He uses this to activate his Elk's ability, sacrificing it to put an island and a mountain into play tapped from his library. This triggers his trio of altars twice, milling the rest of us for 6 more cards, and Danny passes the turn.
Tom casts Splendid Reclamation, returning the 5 lands in his graveyard to the battlefield tapped.
I am so glad that Hugo exiled the rest of his graveyard, or that would have been so much worse for the rest of us.
Indeed it would have. Tom then moves to combat, and Martin responds to this by casting Intimidation Bolt. This creates him another golem, and Martin deals 3 damage to the Fervent Champion. The Knight is destroyed, and unable to attack, Tom ends his turn.
I start my turn by putting a 3rd lore counter on Showdown of the Skald, and then sacrifice the enchantment to its own effects. I then make a slight misplay, playing the Battlefield Forge that was exiled by the Saga, but thankfully this doesn't impact the game in any meaningful way. Next I cast Bruce Toll, Boorish Herder, and General Ferrous Rociric creates me another golem. I scry 1 with Path of Ancestry, keeping the top card of my library where it is, and use Bruce's ETB to give one of my golems double strike and lifelink until the end of turn. I then put a +1/+1 counter on my commander with my Saga's ability, and move to combat, where I attack Tom with all 3 of my golems that are able to do so. Tom responds to this by casting Chaos Warp, exiling the token that I targeted with Bruce Toll's ability. I shuffle my library, revealing the top card to be Rem Carolus, Stalwart Slayer. I put the Griff Rider onto the battlefield, and Tom blocks one of the attacking golems with his dragon. Damage then occurs, with the blocked golem being destroyed and Tom taking 6. Grateful that I now have a flying blocker, I pass to Hugo, and he responds by casting Swords to Plowshares. Hugo exiles Bruce Toll in this way, gaining me 3 life, and then proceeds to his turn.
Hugo plays Temple of Triumph, scrying the top card of his library to the bottom. Next he equips Stoneforge Masterwork back onto his Lion Riding Knight, and casts Tauren Mauler, who is definitely a knight. Moving to combat, Hugo attacks Danny with his Knight of the White Orchid, and Martin with his commander. He draws 2 cards, loses 2 life, and Danny blocks with Reckless Fireweaver. Martin double blocked the 13 powered knight with General Rokiric and a golem taking 5 damage due to Syr Gwyn having trample. In his post-combat main phase, Hugo casts Skull Clamp and attaches it to his Mauler. He then moves his Masterwork over to the Shapeshifter as well, and passes.
Danny once again fails to draw a land, leading us all to question how many he's actually running in the deck, and then casts his commander, Jhoira, Weatherlight Captain. Hugo puts a +1/+1 counter on Tauren Mauler, and Tom, Hugo and I mill 3 cards thanks to the Altars of the Broods. With nothing more to do, Danny ends his turn.
Tom begins his turn by casting Fierce Empath, and Hugo puts another +1/+1 counter on his Shapeshifter. The Empath's ETB then resolves with Tom putting Omnath, Locus of Rage into his hand from his library. Tom then casts the Angry Elemental, and Hugo puts a third +1/+1 counter on his Mauler. Not yet finished, Tom pays 2 life to sacrifice both his Misty Rainforest and Marsh Flats, drawing 2 cards and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on Korvold. He puts a forest into play with the former, but fails to find either a swamp or plains with the latter, as Danny had already milled them all.
Such a terrible shame.
Omnath triggers, creating Tom a 5/5 elemental token, and Tom plays Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth as his land for turn. He makes a second elemental and then moves to combat, where he attacks Martin with his commander. Tom sacrifices an elemental to Korvold's ability, putting a +1/+1 counter on him and drawing a card. Omnath's ability also triggers, and Tom chooses to deal 3 damage to Rem Kaulos in this way. Not ready to throw in the towel just yet, Martin responds this by casting Rootborn Defenses. Hugo puts a counter on his Tauren, and Martin populates, creating another Golem token. All of his creatures gain indestructible until the end of turn, and Omnath's trigger then resolves, but fails to destroy the Griff Riding Knight. Martin then blocks Korvold with his Flyer, and Tom moves to his post-combat main phase. Here he uses his remaining mana to cast Tireless Tracker, Hugo puts another counter on his Shapeshifter, and Tom passes to Martin.
I play a mountain and recast my commander. Hugo puts a +1/+1 counter on Tauren Mauler, and I cast the Kiri Lineslinger, creating a 4/4 golem in the process. Hugo puts another counter on his Shapeshifter, and I pass the turn.
In his turn, Hugo moves his Skullclamp over to Knight of the White Orchid, and then casts Inspiring Veteran. Moving to combat, he attacks Tom with his commander, and Martin with his 2 other creatures that don't have Summoning Sickness. Hugo draws 3 cards, losing 3 life, and Tom double blocks the 14-powered knight coming at him with Omnath and his Elemental. Martin blocks the armor-wearing bull coming at him with a golem, and lets the other knight hit him, taking 4 damage. All blocking creatures are destroyed, and Tom uses both of Omnath's triggers to deal 6 damage to Syr Gwyn, dealing her lethal damage as well. Hugo then proceeds to his second main phase, where he casts Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord. Next, he activates the Planeswalker's Midas ability, where X is 2, returning Leonin Shikarai to the battlefield in this way. Still not finished, he plays Reliquary Tower, and ends his turn.
Danny begins his turn by casting a super shiny Everflowing Chalice, not paying anything for its multi-kicker cost. Hugo puts a +1/+1 counter on his Mauler, Danny draws a card from Jhoira, and everybody other than Danny mills 3. Next, Danny casts Mere Retriever, and Hugo puts another counter on his Shapeshifter. Danny draws, the rest of us mill 3 cards, and the Retriever's ETB fizzles due to Danny having no graveyard. Not yet finished, Danny plays Command Tower, having finally drawn a 5th land.
Took him long enough.
Tom, Hugo and I mill 3 more cards, and Danny casts Scrap Trawler, drawing a card and milling the rest of the table for another 3 cards. Unable to cast anything else with his 1 remaining mana, Danny passes to Tom.
Tom plays Terramorphic Expanse, and his Tireless Tracker creates him a clue with their triggered ability. He then sacrifices the land, putting a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and drawing a card. Tom then searches library for a mountain, puts the land into play tapped, and creates another clue. Not yet finished, Tom casts Natural Order, sacrificing Fierce Empath as part of the cost. Hugo puts a counter on his Mauler, Tom draws, puts another +1/+1 counter on his commander, and puts Eternal Witness onto the battlefield from his library. Tom uses the Shaman's ETB to return the Crux of Fate in his graveyard to his hand, and then cast a spell, choosing to destroy all non-dragon creatures. Hugo puts another counter on his Shapeshifter, and the board wipe resolves, leaving only Korvold and Tauren Mauler still standing. Hugo then draws 2 cards thanks to his Skullclamp, and Danny returns the Enthusiastic Mechanaut and Lotus Bloom in his graveyard to his hand with Scrap Trawler's ability. Tom then uses all of his remaining mana to cast World Shaper, and Hugo forgets to put a +1/+1 counter on his creature.
Oops.
Tom then moves to combat, where he attacks Hugo with Korvold, sacrificing a mountain with the dragon's attack trigger. He puts another +1/+1 counter on him, draws a card, and Hugo takes 15 damage. Pleased with his actions, Tom passes the turn.
In my turn, I recast General Ferrous Rociric, and Hugo remembers his Mauler's ability, putting a +1/+1 counter on him. With nothing more to do, I end my turn.
Hugo starts his turn by casting Acclaimed Contender, and takes a look at the top 5 cards of his library. He reveals the Murderous Rider from among them, putting the Undead Knight into his hand, and then casts the Swift End part of the card, targeting World Shaper. Tom responds by casting Deflecting Swat, changing the target of the kill spell to Tauren Mauler.
Now that is a spicy play.
The Shapeshifter is destroyed, Hugo loses 2 life, and Murderous Rider is put into exile.
He's going on an adventure!
Alright, Bilbo. Deeply saddened by the sudden turn of events, Hugo plays Dragon Skull Summit, and then casts Soul Ring. Fully aware that he is unable to survive another hit from Korvold, Hugo decides to tap out to cast Merciless Eviction, exiling all creatures. The board is once again wiped, and Hugo activates Sorin's +2 ability. He deals 1 damage to Tom, gaining 1 life thanks to Sorin's lifelink, and passes to Danny.
Danny plays Evolving Wilds, milling the rest of the table for 3, and then sacrifices it to put a mountain into play tapped. This forces the rest of us to mill 3 more cards, and Danny casts Dockside Extortionist. Tom, Hugo and I each mill 3, and Danny creates 7 treasure tokens with his Goblin's ETB. This mills the rest of us for 21 more cards, and Danny recasts his commander. Everybody other than Danny mills 3, Danny casts Enthusiastic Mechanaut, and the rest of us mill another 3. Danny then draws with Jhoira, sacrificing 3 treasures to cast Trophy Mage, milling his opponents yet again. He searches his library for Cloud Key, casts it naming Artifact, draws, and mills the rest of us for 3.
This is getting a bit ridiculous now.
He's not even finished yet. Next, Danny casts Trinket Mage, milling Tom, Hugo and I for 3, and searching his library for Soul Ring. He casts the Mana Rock for 3, drawing a card, milling the rest of the table once again, and then casts Blasting Station, repeating this process. At this point, the rest of us have a combined total of 0 cards in our libraries, and Danny passes the turn, causing Tom, Hugo and I to lose in our draw steps. Well, that is it for another game. I hope that you enjoyed watching Danny storm off and win after a really shaky start. Don't forget that you can help to support our channel in 4 quick and easy ways: liking this video, subscribing, hitting that bell icon, and leaving us a comment. I read every one. And if you really like us, then consider checking out our Patreon page, where you can find rewards such as exclusive tokens and playmats for as little as $1 a month. That's all for now though, we'll see you next time. Stay awesome!